What is good, guys, and thanks for tuning in to one of my videos. Here I have got the MPC 2000 XL on the table, and in today's video I wanted to talk about buying older gear, owning older gear, what are the pros, what are the cons, and hopefully it'll help you decide whether it's a good idea for you or whether you go for something a bit more modern. I own two MPCs. I own the MPC 2000 XL, which I have here obviously, and I also have an MPC 2500. Now I'll talk a bit more about the 2500 a little bit later. That was one of my favourite ever beat making devices that I've used, but yeah, for various reasons it's been on the shelf for a very long time. I'll go into that a bit later. So we'll start off with the pros with these older devices. We'll talk about some of the points which I believe to be good reasons for buying older gear like this. There aren't too many of them nowadays, but that being said, the reasons that do make these a worthwhile purchase are very, very strong. So there aren't many, but they're very, very strong, if that makes sense. And maybe these reasons could convince you to pick up this older gear. So the first thing that I'd say about the XL, and I do say this with a bit of a pinch of salt, and I'll try and explain myself, is that this is going to be a much more bare bones, stripped back workflow compared to maybe someone like you that works in a DAW. There's a lot less going on with these devices. Now that doesn't mean that they're easier to use necessarily at first, but once you get the hang of them, it's a very bare bones stripped down workflow. So that's the first point really which I want to say, is that although these devices are old, they're very primitive. So navigating your way around them, it's very simple once you get the hang of it. It's a little bit tricky to work out how to use them, but once you get the flow of it, once you understand where everything lives, it's a pretty bareback and simple workflow to use. And that's one of the beauties of these older devices, is that they just have that kind of minimalist workflow. They have everything you need, but those kind of workflows are what create a certain sound, because you can only do certain things. So that's the first point. Simpler workflow. It can be a little tricky to get your head around at first if you're coming from a different type of sampler, or if you're coming from a DAW like I already mentioned. But once you know your way around it, it's a very bare bones stripped back workflow, so that might suit some of you and you might enjoy that. The second point is, if you're after a certain sound, and I'll go into the sound a little bit later, these older devices are the exact pieces of gear that big names in hip hop were using to create their beats. You'll see the 2000 XL splattered over so many album covers. It's an absolutely iconic piece of gear. The 2500, which I own as well, not necessarily quite as iconic, but that's definitely been used on some heavy beats in the past, and it's still definitely got a place in the history of the MPC. But if you're going after a specific sound, let's say you're going for that golden era sound, which is something that I'm really, really into at the moment. If you like heavy drum breaks, warm samples, and those horn stabs over the top, then this is the gear that those guys were using to create those beats. So although this is only a sequencer, the sound that you get out of it and the way that you make the beats, it's going to be exactly the same as your heroes, if you're into that kind of subgenre of hip-hop like I am. I think that's so exciting to think that you'll be hitting the same buttons and doing the same processes on this device as, you know, world-famous hip-hop artists and producers. So that's another reason why I think these devices are amazing, is you are really, really getting that authentic feel and workflow and sound from these devices, exactly the same as those golden era giants back in the day. So that's quite an interesting and exciting side of it. Okay, moving on to the sound now. Realistically, it would be great if I could give you a demonstration of this, but I'm just going to do this as a talking video. The sound of these devices, the sound of the 2500, the sound of any older gear really. You can get close to emulating it with more modern gear and DAWs, but you're not going to get that exact same kind of raw, warm, just absolutely incredible textures that you can get from these older pieces of gear. And I would probably say that this is one of the main reasons why you'd go ahead and do it. Now, I've even considered using this just to run samples through, just to get that MPC circuitry on my beats. Then I could take that sample and use it in Ableton or something like that and get that really, really authentic sound that this thing can produce. And it's the same with any older bits of gear really. If you run your samples through those things, you're gonna get really close to the classic sounds that this device has created on records over the years. And I think that's one of the most important factors when considering buying an older piece of gear, is that this is the proper way to get the proper sound. Emulation is emulation, but this is the real thing. So if that is something that you really, really crave, if you want that really, really authentic MPC sound, or that really, really authentic hip-hop sound from like the golden era of hip-hop, really look into the gear that those guys were using around those times and start building up a collection of those kinds of things. They're the sort of things that are going to get you the sound exactly how you like it. This is one of them for sure, the 2000 XL, and like I say, I've got the 2500 as well. That can get close, but it hasn't quite got the iconic status of this device. Lastly, I think just the aesthetic of these devices is unreal. I mean, having this on the table, I always find when I'm posting on social media or when I'm making videos about this device, it gets a lot of attention. There's a certain charm to the XL, and it's the history of it, it's the sound of it, it's iconic for sure, and anytime this pops up on social media, you know, you're gonna get a bag full of likes. So if you're looking to get some traction maybe with a beat making channel, if you're into hip hop and you want to get some interest from the older hip hop heads, then this is definitely going to be a device which could potentially get you a lot of traffic, get you a lot of views, get you a lot of interest. But just having this knocking around my studio, I absolutely love the look of it. I think it looks incredible. I love the look of the 2500 as well, even though I think that's a bit more of a kind of Marmite kind of device. Some people love it, some people hate it. I personally think the 2500 looks awesome as well. But yeah, especially the 2000, this device just looks incredible. I mean, the color scheme, the colors of the buttons, the red and the blue and the gray, it's just so iconic, and yeah, I love it for that. And a lot of older gear, you know, people are going after that because of the sound and because of the aesthetic of it. Really can give you some inspiration to come up with some great beats. So that's another great reason for picking up one of these or other older pieces of gear as well. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers most of the positives about this device. If you think I've missed any off, please feel free to leave it in the comments below. I'm now going to move on to some of the cons that you're going to have to put up with older gear like this. Now, my first point, and this is what I was mentioning about my 2500, it's been on the shelf for quite a long time, and that's because, unfortunately, with these devices, things do break. Now, they're older, they've been used and abused. This one is in very, very good condition, but if you browse hashtags about MPC 2000 XLs or anything for any amount of time, you start to see some absolute states of devices, you know, wear marks all over the faces, the pads just absolutely destroyed. So they do take a lot of abuse and things do break. On my 2500, I've had about 5 of the buttons go. So these buttons here, they're actually called pots. So they have little pots underneath them which are triggered when you press these buttons. And over time, they tend to get worn out and go. And on the 2500, I've had about 6 of those go now. So it really is kind of unusable. You can do a little bit of reassignment and reassign pads to do specific things on the 2500, but it really is a bit unusable. So that's going to have to get sent somewhere to be fixed at some point, or I'm going to have to find someone that's a specialist in that kind of thing to be able to fix it for me. I think I'll probably end up hitting up Jazzcat here in the UK because he seems to be a bit of an expert. I think he's based in London. I'd have to send it off to him to get it fixed and explain everything, so it's going to be a lot of hassle, but if I can get my 2500 back working fully again, that would be awesome. I just can't really afford it right now and haven't been able to for a long time, but one day I definitely will get around to doing that. On the 2000 in particular, the pads, the sensors underneath the pads do tend to go, so that's another thing to look out for. You can be hitting the pads, you just don't get the response that you did out of the factory, and that can really affect the beat making experience. So that's another thing that you really need to consider. You know, older bits of gear, they do break, so maybe have a look if there's someone in your local area that can do repairs before you purchase one, or at least someone maybe relatively nearby that you could ship it to and get it fixed if needs be. Okay, so another thing with this device, and it's similar with my 2500 as well, is that the storage for these devices is pretty old school now. So for the 2000, you can actually get SD card upgrades for this. That doesn't help with the speed side of things, but obviously having an SD card is really, really nice, and then you can transfer that to computer relatively easily. This version that I've got, this particular example, is floppy disk. So, you know, the backwards compatibility of it is getting really, really difficult now. Floppy disks are just expensive and hard to find. There's no USB or anything on this, so it really is limited in terms of formats, and that's the same with my 2500 as well. I think that's CF card. Again, you can probably get an SD card upgrade for it, but it's more money on top of the device already, so that is definitely another thing to consider as well. If you're wanting to use this seriously as part of your workflow, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to get sounds on this and off it. So you can obviously record in everything, but it's nice to have a library of things that you can just quickly load onto the device. But yeah, that is one of the big difficulties about these devices, is getting sounds on and off them, and saving information as well is a bit of a pain considering the format. So that's something huge to look out for. You can get upgrades, but it comes at a cost, so you have to be maybe willing to do those as well in order to get the most out of these devices. that leads on to the next point really. These older devices are quite slow to process things. So older MPCs, older SPs from Roland as well, they're really slow at processing, deleting samples. So you do have to have a certain amount of patience to use these devices. That being said, it doesn't mean that things aren't possible on this. I mean, we've already talked about how much of a reputation these devices have got. You can make absolutely killer beats on these. You just have to accept that some of the processes aren't going to be as zippy as these modern devices, which have got built-in SSD drives. These things are running off floppy disk and their internal memory, which is like really, really old, maybe 20 years old. So you're going to have to accept that they're going to be a little bit slower, and you need to be a little bit more patient when you're using these devices. So I think that's everything that I want to talk about in this video. Like I mentioned as well, with the cons, if you've got anything else that you want to mention about the cons, leave it in the comments below if there's something I've missed. Overall, I think the experience of working with an older bit of gear is absolutely incredible. So if you can afford to do it, I definitely recommend it. It doesn't come without its headaches, that's for sure. That's just an obvious thing that's going to happen when you buy an older bit of gear, but the rewards are absolutely amazing. Like I said, you're working on the same gear as some of the legendary beat makers throughout the golden era of hip hop, you know, all the 90s through to the early 2000s, and people are still churning out incredible beats on these devices. So yeah, if you can afford it, definitely try one of these and see how you like it. Some people don't like the workflows, some people do. I personally think the sound, the aesthetic, the fact that, you know, legends of hip hop have used this, for me, it's a bit of a no-brainer to have at least one older bit of gear, and then maybe some more modern things to make the workflow a little bit easier. But yeah, I think that's everything I want to say for this video, guys. So I hope that this helps. If you're thinking of buying an older bit of gear, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I will hopefully be back with more MPC related content very soon. I know I said I wasn't going to upload to this channel much anymore, but I felt that I really wanted to do this video, so maybe there will be some time for me to do some more content on this channel soon. Catch you in the next one. Peace!